What's up, everybody? Welcome back to your favorite New York Jets subscription podcast, Badlands. I'm your host, Joe Caporoso, joined by Paul Kilgallen because we need to have another emergency podcast. The New York Jets have hired Rick Spielman as part of a wider shakeup of their front office. We're going to cover all of the recent moves from the week, but once the Spielman news hit, Paul, I feel like we had to get into the emergency pod booth. So what's your initial take and feeling to him joining the team in a senior advisor role? That's like the current title floating around right now, but something that we've been talking about for a bit here on what we wanted to see the Jets do with their front office. And a lot of those dominoes have started to break in the right direction the past few days.
First of all, I'm pretty sure that Badlands caused this. You guys spent all offseason talking about, or part of the end of the season too, talking about the need for some kind of senior football man to be in charge here. And then you and Connor yesterday talked for 5 minutes about how there hadn't been an emergency podcast in a few days. So, like more ways. Yeah, more ways than one. Badlands is responsible for this news happening today. So I think it's really positive, right? It's kind of drafting off of the structure that was going on in Detroit, which it seems very clear that they're intent on building kind of a similar thing to what Detroit has going. And I think since Saleh has been fired and since we knew that Joe D was going to be fired and kind of this was the direction we were going, we were all hoping to look at what is now surprisingly a model organization in the NFL and try to see what we can learn from that and how we can build something similar. And the happy, convenient thing is that Detroit has a structure in place that, at least on the football field, mirrors a lot of what the good Jets teams have been of the past, right? Where it's a really solid rushing attack with more than one capable body. It's a smash mouth kind of thing. It's a play good defense. It's a be violent thing. So you kind of put all those things together and then you look at the pieces that are coming into place here. And I think Spielman is kind of the one domino that hadn't fallen yet that we were all still waiting and hoping would happen. There was no word that got out that said that this was happening or that they were still looking to fill this role. So it's a really, really nice surprise on a Thursday to hear that we have kind of modeled another piece of the organization after what Detroit's doing.
So if we take a step back to the beginning of the week, I think one of the things we were saying about Muji that we were going to wait and see on is that does he have the ability to make some real structural changes to the Jets front office? And since the beginning of the week, we have started to see movement towards actual structural changes, culminating with this decision today. So they move off their head strength and conditioning coach, Mike Nicolini, who's been here since Saleh started. So sports medicine, you make that change. Phil Savage goes from really kind of being the number 2 or number 3, or really the operating GM since Joe Douglas left, to being downgraded to being more of a consultant, which is fine. Not a bad voice to have around the building, but can't be in a key leadership role anymore. They move off of Greg Nejma, one of the guys we've alluded to who's been here for a really long time, 16 years. I think he's been in the Jets front office, so spans McCagnon, Idzik, Douglas. They move off of him. He has been a senior role of football strategy in the front office. They also get rid of Sochi, who is in another senior management role in the front office. These are names that Jet fans should not know, right? They're kind of guys who have just been in sort of senior personnel roles through large chunks of the drought. So it would make sense that, look, the Jets have not done any winning the last 4 years. So if Muji is going to be able to come in and make his imprint and do things differently, you can't do that if you do what Joe Douglas did, which is effectively just keep kind of everyone from the McCagnon era and then proactively go bring back Rex Hogan. Like he kind of just kept the same people in place. And what you saw with these early week moves is that the Jets effectively either demoted or got rid of like the number like 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the previous regime, especially post Rex Hogan and Chad Alexander. So they kind of cleared out the top there. Then he goes and brings Patton into the organization. Still waiting on exact confirmation of all the details of his role, but he was a scout with Denver. Obviously, he has a relation to George Patton, but he joins up. He will have a senior role in Muji's staff. And then, you have a 39-year-old GM. It's his first time in this role. There's been a lot of concern among Jet fans, first-time head coach, first-time offensive coordinator, first-time GM. you get a guy like Spielman to come in an advisory capacity where he openly said on his podcast, like, I will be looking at how we construct the football operations here, which we've been hammering on that. I can't even talk properly because I'm so surprised with all these moves the Jets are saying in the front office. We've been harping on this because they haven't taken a hard look at the infrastructure since this playoff drought begun. Did they even really have any semblance of traditional football operations in place? Now Spielman could go take a look at that, add to the analytics staff, add to some of the broad personnel department, how that's structured between pro personnel and college scouting, and gives Muji a really like valuable sounding board, right? You need someone who's experienced as him, and he's got quite a long resume. He was obviously involved intimately in this search process, and it's not like he has this official like VP of football operations title, but this is the kind of person that we were talking about that the Jets needed to have involved as they restructure everything. And as I said at the top here, that's a lot of people leaving or being demoted. Now you have to, especially if you reach all the way back to Douglas Alexander and Hogan all leaving and never really being backfilled. Now you have it not just being on Muji to do the rebuilding. He has Spielman to do that as well. So how do you feel about the decision of Spielman being that guy, that sort of mystical senior football advisor that we've been talking about for a while?
Well, I think we can get it to Spielman specifically for sure. Two things I want to note before we get there is number one, it's the first promise to be fulfilled by this regime, right? They got up there at the press conference a week ago and they said winning is about people and we need to get the right people in here. And after coming off 6 years of a GM and 4 years of a head coach that kept making promises and then just not fulfilling them, whether you want to go all the way back to I called Sam Darnold's parents and I told them I'm going to protect him, to all the way at the end of just like the all gas, no brake thing, like just never being a reality. That's not how he operated. So coming off of those two guys, to have these two guys get up in front of a podium on their first day and say, hey, winning's about people. We're going to get the right people in the door. And then in the span of the next 10 days, they fire and hire about 10 people. Is pretty encouraging, right? It's okay. These guys mean what they say and they take fast action, not just action, but fast action, right? They get to it. And so, and the other thing I wanted to note is in the pod that Will and Meeks did yesterday, they were talking about Tom Telesco as a possible senior advisor role. And one of the guys commented underneath it, I think his name was Rami Rome. And he said, yeah, I thought about Telesco too, but I wonder if Muji would be a little bit threatened by Telesco's presence in the room, right? And so now we have a head coach who hired a head coach to work underneath him, and we have a GM who hired a GM to work underneath him. So neither of these guys are threatened, right? They're not worried about the guy over their shoulder that has done this job before that could step in for them if they make the wrong move and get fired, which I think is incredibly impressive in terms of the type of people you want leading your organization, right? So we have two guys who are confident and who will listen to others, right? They brought these people in to listen to them, not to have them stand there. And so that's a really good sign. I think if we get into Spielman specifically, the one, I think, piece of publicly consumable content that everyone is going to remember about Rick Spielman is when the Vikings passed on Justin Jefferson for, was that Jalen Rager, I think?
Yeah, the Eagles passed on Jefferson.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say. The Eagles passed on Jefferson for Rager, and then there was that video in the Vikings war room of Spielman and the assistant GM and kind of everybody celebrating because Justin Jefferson fell to them. And I mean, has a video ever aged like fine wine as much as that one has, right? Like they were completely right. And so you're starting from there with a guy who has a pretty visible public big win in terms of player selection and evaluation. And then you go back to his track record, and he was effectively the Vikings GM from 2006 until I think 2021. He had worked for the organization, but didn't have the general manager title because they did not have one. He was like VP of player personnel for his first 6 years or so. And then eventually they gave him the general manager title. And then they eventually also gave him an EVP title. And so in that time, you kind of look back on some of those drafts and, a couple guys that were taken there. Chad Greenway, who was, had tallied up a good number of sacks. Tavares Jackson, who hung around the league a long time. Ray Edwards was a late round draft pick who picked up 33 sacks in his career. Brian Robeson was another guy that picked up 60 sacks in his career. That was a late round draft pick. Adrian Peterson, Percy Harvin, Everson Griffin was another guy that they took in the 4th round. So they had a pretty good talent for finding pass rushers later on down. And then, some of the guys that are still playing in the NFL today, like Harrison Smith, Cordero Patterson, Jared McKinnon, Teddy Bridgewater, you could kind of say is still playing in the NFL, Anthony Barr. These are guys that are drafted over 10 years ago, and the average NFL career is about 3 years, and they're still knocking around. And these are, Rick Spielman guys. Stephon Diggs, Michael Pruitt, Danielle Hunter, Eric Kendricks, Laquan Treadwell, Dalvin Cook, I don't know if you could say, is really still in the league.
A couple Jets great in there with Harvey and Cook. Yeah.
Tyler Conklin is another Jets great. So like all in all, like it's a pretty good drafting record that he had there. And so to have that voice in the room to add to whatever Muji is going to kind of be operating with as his MO, and probably which is coming from Glenn, will be a really nice voice to have around, right? Even you look at like the most recent drafts, and it's like Jordan Addison, Dallas Turner, Lewis Seen, Ed Ingram, Christian Darrisaw. That was the trade that they swung with us in 2021 to where we took AVT. So a lot of good draft history there. I think, you look at what he's done, you look at what his brother's done in Detroit, and it's hard to really like find a flaw here. So it's exciting. What are your thoughts?
What I'd like, and I think it's good to go through his draft history. And I know in the Discord right now, everyone's combing through every interview he's done in the past 2 years about this year's draft prospects and people on the Jets roster to know what they think. I think what's important to remember, and what I'd like to see from this structure and what I think is going to happen, is I think they are hiring Spielman to do a lot of what the other Spielman has done in Detroit, which is look at how our organization is built on the football operations side. Tell us how to organize these departments. Advise us on the kind of people to hire. Advise us more on process and structure and how we keep business separate from football. I think the people who are going to be making the call in the war room, it's going to be Muji, it's going to be Patton, it's going to be Glenn, it's going to be whoever Muji hires also as his number like 3 or 4, whatever cap guy they bring in. He'll make a couple other hires to flesh out the personnel people around him, and I think also the budgeting around him. So if it allows Muji to focus on the draft and free agency and what to do at quarterback with or without Aaron Rodgers, and Spielman can focus on, man, we got to like totally like get serious about analytics and build this out properly. We need to look at how many people we have as scouts and what regions they cover. We need to look at how we define pro personnel and how that department is structured and who reports to who and how we cross-reference everything. And this is how we had it set up in Minnesota, and this is where it worked, and this is where it didn't work. And hey, Muji, if you're running into some issues here or are stumped on something because you're a 39-year-old first-time GM, call me, bounce it off me, and I could talk through whatever I can from my past experience. I think if he could filter into that role, which is almost more like high tier administration work, which I think is a lot of what the other Spielman did in Detroit, while also being a periodic voice on the personnel evaluation side, that's sort of a perfect arrangement because it takes that off Muji's plate. It takes that off Glenn's plate. Glenn is going to be the front man of the org. Glenn could hopefully kind of be a necessary buffer at times along with Spielman from ownership and business to the football side. And Spielman's a very experienced NFL executive. He's been a GM. He's ran this 33rd team operation. He's now been involved in a multi-month search. He will be a respected voice there if they say, listen, like Woody, Chris, Jaime, let Muji and Glenn do this. This is the route we're going. It might not be immediately popular, but let them do their thing. And instead, let's focus on, you've already made the headway of getting rid of 5, 6, 7 people over the past 2 years who were here for a lot of losing. Here are the right people to backfill their roles. Here are the couple people worth keeping from the previous administrations and build it this way. So listen, the Jets have roughly done exactly what I've asked them to do since like October when it became clear that Joe Douglas was going to be fired. I said they needed a senior experienced advisor who didn't necessarily have to be the GM. That's Spielman. I said they needed to make meaningful subtractions from people who have been here through multiple losing tenures. They've now done that with roughly 4 different people, either being let go or being demoted. Uh, we've all been kind of keen on Glenn being a very likely head coach choice and being a fan of that if it wasn't going to be Vrabel. So I don't have any complaints there. So I think generally it's coming together well. I won't say it's perfect. It's a first time offensive coordinator and head coach. There's going to be bumps along the way. I know people are like lukewarm on the offensive coaching staff, although I think it's a little too early to get too excited or not excited in either direction. But in many ways, these changes in the front office are more important, I think, right now, because if you're holding on to people who have been here for 8, 10, 20 years and have been part of so much losing, it's really hard to start doing things a different way. And they truly have some new voices in place now, and a good mix of young up and coming voices with Muji and Patton, and an experienced voice now with Spielman. So I think structurally, if you're a Jet fan, you should feel good that really this is the first time since the playoff drought started they're making some systemic changes. And I know people, oh, they got to get the change ownership and get rid of Jaime. Like, count Jaime as an owner. He's not going anywhere, right? This is the Jets ownership structure. This is their business structure. They're a very successful business. They make a lot of money. That part of it isn't going to change. The point is keep the business away from the football decision making. Let the football guys make the football decisions. And if they could do that, like any other team in the NFL that has shaky ownership at times, they should be just fine. And also, listen, it seems like the Ravens have been looking at Madden ratings anyway, so maybe some vindication for the Johnson family. I think it's good, though. I mean, the Discord is like purely triumphant jubilee right now. The most excited any fan base has been over a senior advisor being added. But I think the reason for that is this is very not like what the Jets have been doing. And I think that's why there's reason to say, okay, like these guys might actually have a chance to do something different. It doesn't mean it's going to work. It doesn't mean that they're going to be amazing, but they're being given a chance to succeed. Whereas I don't know if previous regimes got all the opportunity that they needed to, or just bluntly didn't take advantage of it. They cut Joe Douglas a big check to build a staff, and he just never really got to it. They've already gotten to it in year one. So that's what makes me happy. PK, I'm rambling. Any final thoughts on how important is all this?
Well, yeah, I think the experience thing, which is you kind of said at the tail end there, is the biggest piece of it, right? He came into a Vikings organization that had been kind of middling for about 5 years before he got there. And over the course of his time there, he had 6 playoff appearances in 16, which is it's not like outrageously good or anything, but it is like consistent ability to win and to rebuild when things happen and when players leave, right? So he's been in the room before. It's very much there's an adult in the room kind of hire who has been there and has had that experience. He did not say in the press release and on the podcast that he spoke on whether or not he will remain with the 33rd team also, but he did say he's being hired full-time by the Jets. So I would assume that means that he's moving on from the 33rd team. But the 33rd team is a very analytics-driven organization. That's kind of the ground level of what their kind of guiding principle is, right? And so I think he has that entire team of people behind him who are thinking in that kind of direction of where football is going. He also had an opportunity to essentially give the Jets organization a colonoscopy for the last 8 weeks, right? And like see the dirty parts and understand where all the bodies are buried and things like that. And so he's coming in with a pretty good base of knowledge. And he's also coming in with obviously the trust of Woody and Christopher and Jaime because they sat with him without a job on the line for 8 weeks while they were interviewing to fill other jobs, right? So when you talk about him being able to get in between Glenn and ownership or Muji and ownership and say, hey, like, let's let these guys work. Like that trust is already built up. So we're coming from a place of like the wheels have already gotten up to cruising speed before he has even started the job. So I really I kind of happen to agree with the Discord. Like, I think there's really nothing super negative that you could poke in this. Will it work? That's a different question. But in terms of having a positive outlook, like there's a lot of really good things here. And there's a lot of good breadcrumbs around the analytics and the experience and the having been in an organization that has both won and lost and seen what good looks like that are going to be really beneficial to the Jets moving forward. So all in all, I think pretty good day. And I would venture to guess that it's not over, right? Like, I don't think this is going to be the last hire or fire that we hear about. I think this is an ongoing process, and I think it'll probably continue through the draft and after the draft. I bet right after the draft, there's kind of another culling of like, okay, like we got all your intel from the last couple of years you were working for the Jets. You can move forward now. And so just another kind of exciting step along the process.
Yeah, I expect over the next few months a couple other subtractions of guys who have been there in that 10 to 20 year range. And I expect a couple notable, or at least one notable sort of analytic database hire. I expect someone with more of a financial cap background to be added in some capacity. And then probably another person with more of a scouting and personnel background to work alongside Patton. So it's new voices. So the process is right. Let's hope the results follow. It clearly something, whether it was the 33rd team, whether it was just how bad everything got the last 2 years, clearly something has gotten through to ownership where they're trying something different. So it was time to try something different. And I think this is progress. And I think the work, as you said, will continue in the coming months. But it's hard for me to say anything, but the Jets got better this week. And I think they've gotten a lot. If you go all the way back to the moment they fired Robert Saleh, and I know it was short-term pain, and I'm sorry, like they went 5-12 with Jeff Ulbrich instead of 7-10 if they kept Robert Saleh the whole year. Like short-term pain, hopefully for a more medium and longer-term gain. Because from the moment they moved off of Saleh and then to Douglas, and even back before the season started and moving off of Hogan and Alexander, it's now like a 12 to 15-month process of they are getting better and they are getting needed new voices into all of those critical roles. If you go back to right before the season, the Jets' decision-making infrastructure was Joe Douglas, Robert Saleh, Rex Hogan, Chad Alexander, Phil Savage, and Nejma were effectively the top 6 guys making football decisions, with ownership very, very involved because they were fed up and they were at the end of the rope with Douglas and Saleh. You look at it now, every name I just read is no longer in that position anymore. Savage is the only one around, and he is only a consultant at this point, so he is not in that top 5 or 6. It is a whole new cast of characters making those decisions, which is now built around Muji, Spielman, Glenn, Patton, and likely some other front office hires. So it is a real true turning of the page. And we could take we'll be back recording an emergency pod, I'm sure, with Aaron Rodgers news within the next 10 to 12 days, but we had to get another one in.
Yeah, one more thing. We mentioned this before we hit the record button, and I forgot to bring it back up again. But in his original kind of sentence on that podcast, he said, right now my biggest project is trying to rebuild the football operations side of things, right? So the implicit meaning there is that it was not there. It was broken down. And I think because of the reasons that you just laid out, like there was a structure in place. It wasn't a good structure, and it was a bare bones structure, and it wasn't as good as other NFL teams, but it was there. But over the last 9 months, it's been completely decimated. And so the recognition of a problem is a giant first step for an organization to take. So again, the implicit meaning there, rebuild the football operations side of things. There's a recognition that it's not there anymore. And that's a really good starting place.
All right, I will wrap with some PSAs, catch up on draft season this morning, catch up on War Room from yesterday. Look out for Buck the Trend and the Discord show this weekend, and a new Sunday AM coffee. And Streets of Fire premieres for our War Room tier on Monday with a conversation between me, Connor, and Steve Gelbs on his first ever appearance on the Badlands feed. And last but not least, badlandstoj.com to buy live ticket shows. If Paul looks stressed out right now, it's because he now quickly has to figure out in the next 2 months how to put on a live show with myself and Connor and everyone else for about 300 people in New York City. But we're still selling tickets, so go grab them at badlandstoj.com. Thank you, everyone. Good day for the Jets, and we will talk to you soon.